You got your handout? If you don't have a handout, I didn't bring it up. So if you look at your handout, last week we talked about some kind of key themes with the Old Testament and New Testament. Mainly, we talked about the fact that Christ is the apex of all the scriptures. The Old Testament points towards Christ, the New Testament points back to Christ, and so we kind of saw how that theme of a coming Savior in the Old Testament, or the way we phrase it is promises made in the Old Testament, shows up in the New Testament as promises kept, and the Messiah has come in the New Testament. This week, and for the next few weeks, we're going to be talking about biblical genres. So, again, when we look at the Bible, the Bible has different parts, different pieces, and they all flow together to tell these main stories and main themes, but they do it in different ways. So if you want to look at the handout, this is kind of a rough list of the biblical genres and where the books fall into the different genres. Obviously, there are some parts of some of these books that will have multiple genres within them. So you'll hear in random parts of the Bible, you'll find histories thrown into psalms and poetry. You'll find gospel references into the epistles. But this is just kind of a rough breakdown. And as you can see on the left side, we've got a couple. Oh, that's not very clear. We've got historical law or narrative. All right, that's going to be most of your Old Testament books. It's going to be the Pentateuch, first 5 books, as well as most of, or a lot of the Old Testament writings, Samuel, Kings, Chronicles, those kind of things are going to be telling historical. Is it one? Yeah, there's another one. Flip them the other way. There you go. That's going to be, again, a lot of the Old Testament is going to fall into the historical law and narrative category. You've got wisdom literature, which is going to cover Job, Proverbs, and Ecclesiastes. Poetry, Psalms, Song of Solomon, and Lamentations. Prophecy, that's going to be most of your Old Testament prophets, or all of your Old Testament prophets. And then apocalyptic literature is going to be the one genre that kind of covers the Old Testament and New Testament. All right, you're going to find that in Daniel as well as Revelation. You've got gospel, so that's the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And we also throw Acts into there because it can be interpreted similarly. And then you've got the epistles, which are the letters that were written by the apostles to us. So those are kind of the rough breakdown, and we're going to go through these. I'm still trying to figure out if it's going to take us 3 weeks or 2 weeks. But today we're going to cover the historical law and narrative section. So I wanted to start with this quote from Nigel Bainan and Andrew Sack from a book called Digging Deeper. Last week we talked about how genres are basically ways that literature is classified based on what's similar to it. So similar types of writings get put together. I thought this was a really helpful quote from these guys from this book. It says, genre is a way of classifying something according to its type or style rather than its specific content or storyline. So again, when we're talking about genres, what genre does a biblical text fall into? We're trying to figure out what type it is. What are other books that are the same type or the same style of writing, rather than the specific content of things. This is why you can find some of the same information in a gospel that you find in an epistle, but they're different genres. They're classified and grouped in different ways, and they can be interpreted in different ways because we're not grouping things according to content, but we're grouping them according to style. So I thought that was helpful. So the Bible, one of the ways that we can kind of describe the Bible is an anthology. You might know what that means? Anthology. You guys have to buy an anthology when you went to high school or college or whatever. An anthology, all it is a collection of books. So sometimes you'll see an anthology of 17th century poetry or something like that. And it'll just be all of these things kind of put together into one thing. Well, where we get our word Bible from is from, oh no, please tell me sorry. I just told her it went through its. Okay. For those of you who don't know, my computer has its own spirit and it just kind of does what it wishes. The Bible is an anthology. It's a collection of books, right? We get the word Bible from the Greek word biblia, which literally means collection of books. Okay, so a collection of books put together. That's what our Bible is. And we've got some different characteristics of the Bible. So if you want to jot these down, I haven't done a PowerPoint, but of course the computer. Sometimes I think my computer's too loud. Here's some characteristics of our Bible and what makes it an anthology, so to speak. First of all, our Bible has multiple authors. Okay, multiple authorship is one big portion of why we call the Bible an anthology. So we know that there's roughly 36 authors to the Bible. So that when you're reading through your Bible reading plan or whatever you might be reading, you're going to be hearing from different people, okay? So you got to know that different people are writing at different times and they write different ways for different reasons and they have different styles. Secondly, the Bible has diverse genres, right? So anyone who has read the Psalms and read Exodus and also read Revelation knows that the Bible has different genres, right? You can't just read the Bible like you would read a novel because it's changing all the time. Because there's different types of writing. Thirdly, there's a rationale for why the Bible was put together the way it was. Okay, so this whole Bible, this is where we go back to a little bit of last week. This whole Bible tells one main story. It's the story of God creating His people, them rejecting Him, Him rescuing them, and ultimately Him coming back to get them. Okay, that's the main story of the Bible. So all these genres, in different ways, teach about this same idea that that theme is what the Bible is talking about. And so the rationale for putting this together was to say, okay, we're going to have one God in His providence, and we're going to have one place where you can find out all you need to know about me and about my plan for the world. And that's the rationale behind it being put together. Fourthly, it's comprehensive, or the Bible covers all of what we need to know about God. Right? Most anthologies, what they try to do is for instance, you have your anthology on 17th century poetry. What they'll try to do is they'll try to give a big picture view and get all the different kinds of things you need to know about 17th century poetry. Okay? And so the Bible it's comprehensive. It covers from start to finish. So literally from eternity past to eternity forward, and everything in between is covered in the Bible. And then lastly, we can call the Bible an anthology because it has a strategy for the way it's organized. Okay, so if you pick up, we'll run with this idea, this example. You pick up an anthology on 17th century poetry, there's probably going to be a certain way it's structured. Most likely, it's either going to be structured chronologically, right, all the way through the 17th century, or it's going to be structured by the different types of poetry that showed up different times. The Bible's in the same way. It has a strategy for the way it's organized. Okay, the Old Testament was put together as the Old Testament and not together with the New Testament for a purpose. So that when we're reading the Old Testament, all these ideas kind of flow together until we get to where's the Savior that you've been telling us is coming for thousands of pages. Okay? Then the New Testament, right, in the same way comes and shows us how that Savior came. And so it's put together in a specific way so that we can more easily understand what it's trying to tell us. Does that make sense? So, moving forward, again, we're running with this idea that all the biblical genres, so if you look down on that page, all those different genres are going to be telling us one overarching story. Okay, they're going to be telling us the story of the gospel, that God created us, that we rejected God, man rejected God, that God sent Christ as a substitute, right, to take the place of sinners on the cross, and that one day He will ultimately come back and glorify and make all things new. Right? That's what all these genres are trying to tell us. And I want to give you an example to kind of make this a little clearer. So if you wanted to find out, okay, who is Luke? Okay, who could you ask? Well, you could ask Shannon, right? That might not look good for me if you do that. Right? You could ask Shannon, who is Luke? What is Luke like? What does Luke like to do? What's his personality like? Okay, so you could ask Shannon. You could ask my dad. Okay, my dad should know me pretty well. You could ask my brother. You could ask my boss. Or you could ask my friends. You could ask Clint. Please don't ask Clint. Right? You could ask all these different people. Now, what would all these different people have? And to have different viewpoints about who I am. So when they start to tell you who Luke is, right, my dad is not going to say the same thing about who I am than Shannon is or Clint is. Right? My dad remembers when I got kicked out of 8 preschools when I was a kid. It's a true story. Shannon doesn't remember those things, right? She doesn't remember me as the crazy little kid. So you're going to get these different viewpoints. Now, what are these different viewpoints going to do? Right? Hopefully, they'll give you a better picture of who I am. All right, so you'll understand that Luke was the crazy kid who, right, this Luke was the kid that doesn't need to be like, well, that kid doesn't need to be saved. No, Luke did need to be saved. It's crazy. You're going to get that view. You're going to get the view of a wife about her husband, of a boss about their employee. You're going to get all these different pictures that hopefully will give you a better viewpoint of who I actually am. The Bible's in the same way. The reason why the Bible has so many different genres is that it's going to give us different viewpoints about God. We're going to learn different things by reading the Psalms than we will by reading the Old Testament histories. We're going to learn different things about God by reading the Gospels than we will about reading about God in the wisdom literature. Does that make sense? You're going to get different viewpoints about God. So the Bible's going to give us this one big overarching picture about who God is. So it's going to tell you one main story in many different ways. That's the kind of idea we want into here with genres. Any question before we dive into actually the genre that we're going to talk about today? Nope? Alright. So today we're going to be talking about studying histories and narratives. Okay, so if you look back to your genre sheet, I ran out of copies. You'll see that the books that are going to fall into this category are Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, Numbers, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, and Jonah. Okay, those are the books that are going to fall into this historical law narrative category. It should be the top one on your sheet. So the goals when we're studying historical law and narrative books. Okay, first off, as a narrative is going to be telling you a story about something that happened. Okay? So if you read a history book, hopefully the history book will be telling you the right things that happened in history. Same way, these historical books that we find in the Bible are telling us historical things that happened. Okay? So first off, we want to find out what happened. Okay? Does this ring a bell to anything we've been talking about for a few weeks? We want to make the observations. Make the right observations about what it is that happened. Okay, so when you're reading through the Old Testament and you see that, say, in Exodus 1, Pharaoh gets kind of freaked out because the people of Israel are getting too big, and he gets so paranoid that they're going to say that they're going to join these other nations and fight against them. So he starts to treat them as slaves. That's a historical documented fact that happened, and so we got to find out what happened there. Okay, so we want to make observations. Secondly, we want to find out why it happened. Okay, so historical narratives are going to tell you a lot of details, and you could just read it as a textbook and just find out what happened. Okay, there are people who get paid lots of money to be professors in college who know exactly what happened in all of these Old Testament books, but they misinterpret why it happened. Okay, and so we want to find out what happened and why it happened. So we want to make good observations and good interpretations. All right, these narrative types of books should be really easy to find observations. So if you've read those, right, if you just read them, you should be able to find out what happened. The hard part about these is finding out why it happened. Okay, this is where you can get into a lot of trouble if you just start, making up these reasons for why things happen. So we want to find out what happened and why it happened. So here's some things we need to remember as we start to study these historical law narratives. The things we're reading really happened. Okay? Just pause there. Make sure that sinks in. Okay. When you're reading a historical narrative in the Old Testament, it's going to seem really weird, a lot of the stuff that happens. Okay? Like the earth gets flooded. Okay? Like a nation walks up to a sea and it just splits in half. And they walk through it. Right? There's a guy who's swallowed by a fish and then gets spit back up a few days later. And he's like, perfectly cool. And he starts just going about his business. Okay? These things seem really, really strange. Especially when you read the Old Testament. And they seem really strange. But the one thing we've got to remember is that we believe these things really happened. So even as strange as they might sound, right? As strange as they might seem in your normal day-to-day life, they did really happen. If you're like me, that's one of the most difficult parts about studying the Old Testament. Okay? I remember a few weeks ago, I sent Michael White an email and I said, Michael, I'm reading the Old Testament. It just seems really weird. And sometimes I just kind of doubt that this stuff could really happen. It's like, there's no way this could happen. It looks so different than the world I live in. I said, is that okay? You know, I'm wanting him to like reassure me. And he responded back and he said, no, sometimes I think the same thing too. Right? When you live in a world that you seem to be able to comprehend and you put it in categories, and then you read a story that's supposed to be true about something that looks completely opposite from that, it can be difficult to kind of come to grips with the fact that this stuff really happened. Well, the thing that we have to do is we have to believe it really happened. Okay? We can't just explain away these seemingly miraculous things in these narratives because we don't see them every day. Right? If you're a Christian, one of the foundational things about being a Christian is that you believe in a God who can work miracles. Right? Namely, that he could save a sinner that has rebelled against him and could care less about God. And so these things that seem miraculous, we have to remember they really happen. One of the reasons why it's important that we do this is a really slippery slope if you start to explain away some of these miraculous things. And it gets to the point where you can even explain away your sin, so to speak, okay? You can explain away the fact that you can say, well, the world's so much different now. Obviously, the Bible's old and outdated when it's talking about these certain issues. So we can't really trust the Bible about certain issues because it's so old. Right? It doesn't understand all the things we now know because, as you know, we're the most wise time that ever lived. Okay? Wonder what they'll be saying about us in 2,000 years. We've got to prove these things are true because if we don't, we get on this slippery slope where we start to explain away the miraculous things of the Bible. And the thing that makes the Bible different than most other books in the world is that it claims to be talking about a miraculous person who does miraculous things. And so we've got to believe that these things are really true. The other reason why we have to believe that they're true is because these narratives give us historical facts that are given to us to teach us theological truths. Okay? So a lot of times, I know for me personally, I think, oh, well, I need to know some theology about some certain issue. So I automatically go to the New Testament because I'm like, well, of course, Paul and the epistles are going to give me all the theology I need. Well, the Old Testament is just as full of theology as the New Testament is. Right? But the way it does it is it shows us these things that happen and it displays to us theological points that we should gain from reading them. Does that make sense? So is everyone convinced that we should take these things as literally true? Okay. Now, I'm not saying that's easy. Okay. There are some. So, for instance, just one debate that you can feel free to have. So, Genesis 1. God creates the world 7 days. All right. Was that 7 24-hour days? Is it not 7 24-hour days? Is it? I don't know. Is it? Is it not? There's room to interpret, well, what does it mean by that? Okay? What does it actually mean that God created the world in 7 days? But we have to believe God created the world in 7 days of some sort. Does that make sense? I know that's a little tricky. So I feel like the teacher who's just told you to do something and then said, but then there's the exception to the rule where you don't have to do that. But there's room to debate and have good conversations, but the principle that we have to build on is that we think all these things really happen. We believe they really happen. Does that make sense? Now, point 2, I'm going to tell you that just because it's in a historical law or narrative book doesn't mean it really happened. Okay? Flip in your Bibles to 2 Samuel He goes, what in the world? I'll never come back to this guy. 2 Samuel 12. This is a pretty, if you've been in church for any number of times, you might have heard this story. So where we're at in 2 Samuel, David is the king. He has taken Bathsheba and then killed Bathsheba's husband. And it's like, this guy is supposed to be the man after God's heart. And he just did some pretty weird stuff. So Nathan is coming to David, and here's the interaction we get from Nathan and David. 2 Samuel 12. We're going to look at verses 1 to 6. It says, "And the Lord sent Nathan to David, and he came to him and said, There were two men in a certain city, the one rich and the other poor. The rich man had very many flocks and herds, but the poor man had nothing but one little ewe lamb, which he had bought. And he brought it up, and it grew up with him and with his children. He used to eat of his morsel and drink from his cup and lie in his arms, and it was like a daughter to him. Now there came a traveler to the rich man, and he was unwilling to take one of his own flock or herd to prepare for the guest who had come to him. But he took the poor man's lamb and prepared it for the man who had come to him. Then David's anger was greatly kindled against the man, and he said to Nathan, As the Lord lives, the man who has done this deserves to die, and he shall restore the lamb fourfold, because he did this thing, and because he had no pity." Okay? So right there, 2 Samuel 12. Here's the principle that when I say not everything really happened, the principle I'm trying to get at is this. Sometimes within these narratives, you're going to get other literary devices woven in. Okay? So we don't have to take the fact that there was really this rich man and poor man, this example that Nathan is using, as literally true. Okay? It's an example. Right? It's a parable of sorts. In the New Testament, we're used to these, where Jesus says, no. There's a man who was out in the field, and he found his treasure. Then he went and sold all his stuff and got the treasure. Okay, we're used to that stuff. In the Old Testament, this happens some too. Right? There are literary devices still used in the Old Testament. So you don't have to take the point of view that this example is literally true. Okay, you're free to interpret that as, no, this is Nathan using a literary device to help prove a point. In the same way, this happens throughout the Old Testament in different ways. And this is why we have to read carefully. This is why making good observations is important. So when we know David's a real person, right? We know this stuff's happening. We know Nathan's a real person. So when in verse 1 it says, "And the Lord sent Nathan to David," okay, we know this is a real interaction they're having. This story was really told from Nathan to David. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the story itself is literally true. Okay, does that make sense? This is why we spent so much time a few weeks ago talking about making good observations, because we've got to start with good observations to get the facts of the story before we can interpret it. Okay? We see here in 2 Samuel 12 that the reason this example is given is verse 7. Nathan said to David, "You are the man." Okay? Nathan's telling a story to prove a point that, no, you are the guy who took the little lamb from Uriah, his only thing that he had. You had all this stuff, and you took the one thing he had. Does that make sense? Yes? Good. So we believe that everything in the Old Testament, in these narratives, is true. It's a real fact. It happened. But there are also literary devices woven into these things, into these stories that we have to look out for, so that we don't start quoting stories that were used as examples. Good? All right. Moving forward. The third point about reading these, interpreting these Old Testament narratives is that not everything that happens in the narrative is affirmed as good. Okay? So you read the Old Testament, you're going to find some crazy stuff. All right? Men having, tons of wives and all this kind of stuff happening. All right, let me give you some examples of this about how not everything that happens in narratives is affirmed as good. All right, you guys remember Cain? All right, Cain goes out and kills his brother. Just because it's in there doesn't mean Cain was in the right to do that. Okay. Joseph's brothers. Okay, kick him in the pit and sell him to the Egyptians. All right. Anybody who's had siblings has thought one time in their head, they're honest. Kick my sibling into a pit and sell it to somebody. Just kidding. I was a bad kid, but not bad. Joseph's brothers. Abraham kind of rolls up into Egypt and then says, hey, you're pretty good looking. They're going to want you, so just tell them you're my sister. Okay? Probably not a good idea. General principle to all men in here. Never say your wife is your sister. And then Jacob deceiving Esau, right? Jacob stealing Esau's birthright. Okay, and those are just from Genesis. Okay, we can go forward, and there's a lot more. But not everything that happens in a narrative is affirmed as good. Okay? Again, one of the reasons why we have spent so much time on interpretation, because one of the big things we have to find out when we're reading about something is this action being told as something meritorious that's happening, a good example of something that happened? Is it an example of somebody doing something wrong? Do we even know? Sometimes you don't know, right? Sometimes you read a story like, oh, is that right? And then you have to go back 20 chapters to find out whether or not it was right. And we spend so long in interpretation on these things because we want to make sure that we get these ideas right? We don't want to be following an example of somebody who's in the Old Testament as a bad example. We don't want to use somebody as an example from the Old Testament who's bad as an example for us to say something is good. All these things we want to make sure that we do those correctly. Just because something's in a historical narrative doesn't mean you should do it. Okay, that's the principle we're rolling with here. I'll give you an example. Last year I went on vacation and I took this, I was really ambitious, I'm just going to read this huge biography. So I took this 1,000-page biography of Winston Churchill. Okay? I'm talking about gigantic, which was really dumb. I only got 150 pages. But as I'm reading this biography of Winston Churchill, obviously, right, we get to some point in the late 30s, early 40s, and this guy rolls up on the scene. Hitler, you guys have heard of him, right? In the same way that I read that historical biography, and the first thing I don't say is, oh wow, I should do that. I should be just like Hitler. The same way, there are people in the Old Testament that are examples as what not to do. Okay? You guys have heard the phrase, don't be that guy? Okay, there's some don't be that guys in the Old Testament that we got to look out for. And so that's why we have to read carefully, observe rightly, interpret rightly. Because in a few weeks we're going to get to application. And a lot of times what you'll hear is, well, you can't really apply the Old Testament. Right? You just got to read it. Well, no, you can make applications from the Old Testament. It's just more difficult because you have to spend the time interpreting right. Okay? In the New Testament, when you get to the epistles and Paul is telling you, don't do this. Well, the application is pretty easy. Don't do that. Okay? In the Old Testament, a lot of times you're going to read these stories about people who are given as negative examples. And the principle is, don't be like this guy. And the application you have to come to is, well, what would it look like for me in my time to be like that guy? And then we have to make those applications. Does that make sense? All right, and then lastly, what time are we at? Lastly, this is just a principle to help hopefully ease your mind as you're reading the Old Testament. Once I kind of finally got my head around this, it helped me relax a little bit. But all narratives in the Old Testament are, one, they're selective, and two, they're incomplete. Okay? So my biography of Winston Churchill that I was reading, it was a selective biography. There were certain things that the biographer said, I'm going to put those in there. And there are certain things that they said, that's not what they need to know, I'm not going to put that in there. Okay, so it's an incomplete, every biography is an incomplete biography. It'd be impossible to tell you what I was thinking every 2 seconds of my life. Okay? But you pick out the important things. In the same way, the Old Testament, these writers, by the Spirit, have written these documents, and we know that it covers all that we need to know. Right? All we have to know about life, about God, about who we are, about who God is. And then eventually, when we get to the New Testament, the Bible covers all we need to know about how to be made right with God, how to live in light of this fact that God has come to save us. But that doesn't mean everything is covered. Okay? In the New Testament, we'll see this same principle in the Gospels, where one gospel writer says, and Jesus did many more things that were not written down in this, but these were written so that you might know God. Okay, basically is the gist of it. But that doesn't mean everything was there. So sometimes when you're reading these, Old Testament narratives, and you'll get to a point, and it'll be like, okay, that's the end of the story about this character. So this character, We got this character, we got this character, and this one, this one, this one, this one, this one. You read like 2 pages worth of genealogies. And then it's like, okay, now we're getting to the next important character. Okay, so sometimes you'll skip generations of people. Like, between you, your kids, from your grandparents to your great-grandkids. And you'll just skip them. Now they're important, right? They play a part. They preserve this kind of line. Remember, we're talking about from last week the promise that was kept, or the promise made that the Savior's going to come. They play an important role, which is why Matthew 1 is just a long list of genealogies to prove to us that those people mattered. But at the same time, you're not going to get all the details about them. Okay? People find it hard enough to read a book this long. If you had the whole thing, it'd be like one of those, those books that you stand and turn the pages on, because they're not all the details are there. And so again, what we have in our Bibles, this is a principle for the whole Bible, but what we have in our Bibles, especially in these Old Testament narratives, is exactly what we need to know to understand what God wants us to know from the Old Testament. Okay, so we shouldn't freak out and lose our minds when we're like, wait a minute, why did we just skip 2 generations? Or why do I not remember this guy who just kind of shows up and is there for like 2 days and then just leaves? Okay? That's because not all the details are given. It's telling a particular story. Does that make sense? So, 9:55. Last time for questions this week. Do we have any questions right off the bat from anything we talked about today? Any questions that I can send off to the smarter people to get the answers with?
I think one of the things that the way you covered that also challenges us that if we don't have that full comprehension of what we're reading, it entices us to do more research. Mm-hmm. Because to your point, there's so many authors out there that delve into select scripture to expound on what that is without changing the content of what the scripture is actually leading us to.
Yep. That's a really good point. So I would say that that's true and the opposite is true. So don't just read through the Old Testament just to check it off your Old Testament reading box, okay? So we're doing a reading plan, and literally last night, so I'm like 2 weeks behind. Full confession, won't take it. Yeah. I'm behind. And so I sat down to start reading. I'm going to catch all the way back up. And I got about halfway through what I was behind. And I got to the point where I'm not even comprehending any of this. So I just stopped. I was, all right, I'm just going to read what I read today, try to remember what I read today. Because you don't want to just gloss over it for the mere purpose of checking it off. At the same time, while you're reading it, if you don't understand what it means, then stop. And use our other interpretation techniques that we talked about last week. Okay? One of the things that makes the studying Old Testament intimidating is that a lot of the ideas come in big chunks. So you need 12 chapters to hear about from the time Moses is, called by God to the time Moses actually leads the people out of Egypt. You gotta have 12 chapters. Well, you're not gonna sit there and cross-reference every single verse for 12 chapters. You're studying for 6 weeks. Right? You get fired from your job. But if you have to slow down and take the time to really get the main points that you need to get, you can use those other interpretation techniques, the cross-references, the commentaries, right? One thing that's been really helpful for me is I found a whole Bible commentary that puts the books in like 20-page chapters. And so if I'm confused, I know somewhere in that chapter he's going to cover at least what I'm talking about for a little bit of time. And then if you get to a point where you really don't understand, that's when you can just stop and really dive in and focus on what that is. Because again, what we talked about last week, the Old Testament is like a snowball, okay? So, the fall in Genesis 3, right? God makes a snowball and sits it on top of a hill and then just kind of sets it off rolling, right? You get this little glimpse of he will crush your head, you will bruise his heel. And then the whole Old Testament is snowballing into, when you get to Matthew, you should be like, wait a minute. This is the frozen, do you want to build a snowman? Huge snowball that has fallen to the bottom of this hill that we now know about. That's a good point. Anything else?
What commentary are you talking about?
The one I'm using right now is called The King and His Beauty. by Thomas Schreiner, I think is the name. It's been really helpful. It's Thomas Schreiner.